All right, now let's think about the effect of international trade in this, this Heckscher-Ohlin model. So now we're going to have two economies. Each economy, there will be two goods, two inputs. What we're going to do is we're going to assume, just to make it simple, that our two economies have the exact same technology. We could allow one to have different technology than the other. That just makes it more complicated, and really that change in technology is just going to show up as a difference in their production possibilities frontier. So for now, what we can do is just ignore that. Let's just let them have the same technology, and let's allow the differences in their production possibilities frontiers to come from the fact that they have different abundance of factors. So we're going to assume that home has a higher ratio of labor to capital than foreign. So home is going to have a higher ratio of, what did I say, labor to capital than foreign. So we would say that home is labor abundant compared to foreign. Home is labor abundant, and foreign is going to be capital abundant. Now we've talked about what that means in terms of the production possibilities frontier. So now it's simply a matter of thinking about what the PPFs look like for home and foreign. Let's put one there and let's put the other one here. So let's think about home. Let's think about foreign. We've got the quantity of cloth on our horizontal axis, the quantity of food on our vertical axis for both of them. Quantity of cloth, quantity of food. Because home is labor abundant, its production possibilities frontier is going to be shifted out in the direction of cloth, because production of cloth is labor intensive. Production of cloth is going to be labor intensive at home and also in foreign, because we're assuming that they have the same technology. Foreign is capital abundant, so its production possibilities frontier is going to be pushed up in the direction of the good that is capital intensive. So its production possibilities frontier is going to look something like this. And it's going to be this difference between the production possibilities frontiers that creates an opportunity for them to trade. So what we know when the two countries trade is that the relative output price is going to be equalized between the two countries. And we've talked about that before. Let's talk just briefly about why that has to be true. I don't think I did that the first time I mentioned it, and probably you may already understand it, but let's just run through why the presence of trade is going to equalize prices between the two. And this will actually have direct relevance on something that we're going to talk about here in just a second. Let's use a simple example. Let's suppose the price of gas in Warrensburg was higher than the price of gas in Sedalia. Okay, so let's suppose in Warrensburg the price of gas was $5 a gallon, and Sedalia it was $2 a gallon. What's going to happen is people are going to be bringing gasoline from Sedalia into Warrensburg. So if I were somebody with the ability to transport gas, I would go buy it for $2, bring it to Warrensburg. Let's ignore the complication that it might be illegal to individually sell gas. Let's just pretend that's not the case. I would go get gas in Sedalia, buy it for $2, bring it to Warrensburg, sell it for $5. I'm arbitraging that market. But as people do that, what's going to be happening is the demand for gas in Sedalia is going to be going up, which will be driving that price up. And as people bring gas to Warrensburg, the supply of gas in Warrensburg is going to be going down, or excuse me, the supply is going to be going up, which will drive price down. So in Sedalia, where the price started low, it's going to be rising. In Warrensburg, where the price started high, it's going to be falling. And that arbitrage of the market is going to continue until those prices come together, until there's no opportunity to buy low and sell high. And so that's a very simple way of understanding why trade is going to equalize the prices. So we're going to end up, once we open up trade between home and foreign, we're going to end up with some relative price of cloth that's equal between the two. But here's what we know. For any given relative price of cloth, home is going to produce a higher ratio of cloth than foreign's going to produce. If we were to look at an ISO value line that has equal slope here, let's draw one there and one here, the place where the slope of these two PPFs is equal, I'm assuming that the slope of that line is equal to the slope of that line. What we see is that in home, we're going to have a higher relative amount of cloth produced to food than we will in foreign. So at any relative price of cloth, home is going to produce a higher ratio of cloth to food. Here's what that means. This means that home's relative supply curve for cloth lies to the right of foreign's. So if we take the implication of that, and let's draw a picture here that shows the relative supply curves. So up here we've got the relative price. We've seen this before. And we've got the relative quantity. Let's be specific about what that quantity is. That's the relative quantity, total quantity of cloth produced in the world. So that's going to be the quantity of cloth produced at home plus the quantity of cloth produced at foreign, divided by the quantity of food produced at home plus the quantity of food produced in foreign. What we've just seen is that home's relative supply curve is going to lie to the right of foreign's relative supply curve. Let's assume, to make this simple, something that we've also done in a previous situation where we were looking at this relative demand, relative supply picture. Let's assume relative demand is the same between the two countries. So we can draw a single relative demand curve. In the absence of trade, the relative price of cloth in home would be right down here, and the relative price of cloth in foreign would be right up here. Trade is going to bring these two prices together, so our world price is going to end up somewhere in between the autarky price in foreign and the autarky price in home. So our relative price is going to converge between the two prices that would exist in home and foreign, just like our relative price of our price of gas would converge between the price of gas in Warrensburg and the price of gas in Sedalia, without giving these some functional forms, without giving you the mathematical functional form for the relative demand curve and the relative supply curves. I can't tell you exactly whether it's going to be closer up here or closer down there. We'll just put it somewhere in the middle. What we get then is that in home, the relative price of cloth is going to rise. So relative price of cloth rises. We know that home is going to produce more cloth. So home produces more cloth. Home produces more cloth compared to food. In foreign, the opposite will happen. The relative price of cloth falls. Foreign's going to produce relatively more food. Foreign produces more food. home will export cloth, foreign will export food. So what we understand from this is that home exports cloth, which is not surprising because it is abundant in the input that is intensive in, that cloth production is intensive in. Foreign exports food. So the general result that we get is that countries are going to tend to export those goods whose production is intensive in the input for which they are relatively well endowed. Okay? We need to think a little bit now about how trade is going to affect the workers and capital owners in each of our countries. So I need to clear this off and then we'll run through what that looks like. Let's think about how trade is going to affect the distribution of income in our two countries. So let's think about an increase in the relative price of cloth. That happens at home. Increase in the relative price of cloth, which of course is price of cloth divided by the price of food. So at home we have this increase in the relative price of cloth. What we saw earlier is that's going to increase the purchasing power of labor. Increase the purchasing power of labor. Workers are going to be better off when trade is opened up. But what we also saw is that decreases the purchasing power of capital. So in home, when trade is opened up, it's going to change the output prices. It's going to drive the relative price of cloth up. Workers are going to be happy about that. Capital owners are not going to be happy about that. Capital owners would oppose free trade in this particular situation. If we think about what happens in foreign, we have a decrease in the relative price of cloth. And so we're going to get the reverse effect. So what will be happening in foreign when trade is opened up is that capital owners would be made better off and labor would be made worse off. And so in each country there's going to be one group that's made better off and one group that's made worse off. And the key, kind of the way that you remember this, is that the owners of a country's abundant factor gain from trade. That's our kind of our basic conclusion here. The owners of a country's abundant factor gain from trade. Owners of a country's scarce factor hurt by trade. So if we look at historically, the U.S. has been abundantly endowed with highly skilled labor. Relatively, low-skilled labor is scarce. And remember, we're not talking about the absolute amount of high-skilled labor and the absolute amount of low-skilled labor. It's a ratio that we're thinking about. But the U.S. has been historically abundant in high-skilled labor relative to low-skilled labor. And what this model tells us is that the high-skilled laborers are going to be made better off by the opening of free trade. Low-skilled labor is going to be made worse off. And if you look historically at what's happened in the U.S., you do tend to see low-skilled laborers oppose free trade. If we look at different industries where low-skilled labor is used, production of shoes or production of clothing, you tend to see those sectors hurt by free trade. And those sectors typically are going to be arguing against free trade. And this model helps us understand why that would be the case. Let's talk for just a little bit about factor price equalization. That's something that this model predicts. So let's think about it. Factor price equalization. So what this model tells us is that when we open up free trade, the output prices are going to be equalized between the two countries. And we saw earlier that there's a direct relationship between the output price in an economy and the relative wage. So there's a link between this price, the relative price of cloth, and the relative wage. We drew a picture of what that looked like. So if the relative output price is equalized between the two countries, this model predicts that the relative wage would be equalized between the two countries. The problem is that we don't observe that in the real world. And so that's one of the predictions of this model that we don't tend to see. A lot of what this model predicts, we do tend to see in terms of who would benefit from trade and who would be hurt by trade, and consequently who would support free trade and who would oppose free trade. We tend to get nice predictions that match up with what we see, but in terms of this factor price equalization, we don't tend to see that. And so the question that economists ask, that international economists ask, is, well, why do we not see that? We see equalization in terms of world prices, but not in terms of the factor prices, and there are a few possible reasons. One of the things that we're assuming in this particular model is that both countries produce both goods. Both countries produce both goods. In the real world, that may not necessarily be the case. You may have some countries that we've just got two goods here. In the real world, countries produce lots and lots of goods. And so there may be some countries that don't produce large quantities or a whole lot of variety of output goods that other countries are producing. And in that case, that can cause the relative wage not to be equalized between the two countries. So that's a possibility. We've also assumed that in our example, in the model that we've worked through, we've got the same technology. Turns out that if you relax that assumption, you can get a situation where the relative wage is not equalized, even when the output prices are equalized. So that's a characteristic of this model, that an assumption that we're making that leads to this conclusion that we don't tend to see in the real world. It can also be the case that the relative world price may not completely converge, and so output prices might not converge. And there are a couple of reasons why that might be the case. One possibility is that there are going to be transportation costs. So think about that example I gave you about the price of gas in Warrensburg versus Sedalia. It might not be the case that, let's say it this way, there might come a time when it's not worth it for me to drive to Sedalia and bring back a truckload full of gas to Warrensburg. If the price was only, say, 10 cents difference between a gallon of gas here and a gallon of gas there, then that might not be a big enough difference for it to be worth my time to drive there, bring a tanker full of gas here, and go through the process of selling it. So it could be that there are transportation costs. That's very common, obviously, with international trade. So transportation costs can keep the world prices from, or the prices in the two countries from converging, which clearly would keep the factor price ratio from converging. We'll talk about tariffs. So we could have a situation where the countries are imposing tariffs. That will keep the output prices from converging. We could just put other restrictions that we don't need to talk about now, but there could be other restrictions imposed on trade that keep our output price from converging and consequently keep the factor prices from converging to each other. The last thing I want you to do is take a look in this particular chapter about kind of the empirical evidence for the Heckscher-Ohlin model. I've talked about just a little bit of it here, but there's a section in your textbook that I think is going to be good for you to take a look at. And that's the end of the Heckscher-Ohlin model. In our next set of videos, we're going to talk about another trade model, and then once we get through that, we're going to start thinking about how tariffs work, how some other trade restrictions work, the benefits that they might have, but more importantly, the costs that they have. So I will see you in a future video.